Good morning. Good morning and welcome. Something extraordinary is happening right now in our lifetimes. A major body of water which has been inaccessible to human utilization for essentially all of human history is opening up. In the last 40 years, 2/3 of the ice in the Arctic Ocean has disappeared. And it is, I believe, the equivalent of the discovery of the Mediterranean Sea. Unfortunately, during the development of the land surrounding the Mediterranean Sea, there ensued several thousand years of war. And we're hoping that we can avoid that outcome with regard to the opening up of the Arctic. The Arctic has enormous potential in terms of travel, transportation, communication, energy, and international cooperation. And we're delighted this morning to have a distinguished group of both policymakers and experts on the opening up of the Arctic, Arctic policy, the role of Arctic policy and indigenous peoples. So I'll begin this morning. Turn it over to you, sir.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here with all of you. And as Senator King says, it's amazing what's happening in the Arctic. It's sad because ice goes away. It's sad because we're influenced by war in other parts of the world. But it's also fantastic how the Arctic has changed over the last 30 years, where more power has been given to the indigenous peoples who used to steward the land in the north, now grabbing some power back. We see that education opportunities for peoples in the north is happening. We see that people work across borders and collaborate. And the Arctic is not limited to the high Arctic. It stretches all the way to the north, like here in New England. So we have this great family who is devoted for peace and cooperation in the north. And with that, I think we will have an opportunity for a prosperous future for mankind if the stewardship and the way we collaborate is done in a good way. It is challenging days because of this, and let's hope we don't get thousands of years of wars, but rather thousands of years of constructive solutions. So thank you.
Thank you. And I should have asked, we all should introduce ourselves first. I'm Angus King. I'm the United States Senator representing the state of Maine in Washington. And
I am Lars Kullerud, the president of University of the Arctic, a corporation of more than 200 universities around and about the north and the Arctic. For the time being, or minus 55 members from Russia, which are now in a pause in our collaboration. But else, we work together for the north around the Arctic. So that's me.
And your home, Lars?
I'm from Norway, and I used to be a geologist once upon a time, and I'm a happy liver with a family. You could add my great-grandfather, he was a whaler in the Arctic. He went first to northern Norway, killed all the possible whales. Then he went to Iceland to kill all the whales. Then he went to Antarctica and killed all the whales. He was very proud of that. I was not equally proud. But anyway, that's how life is in the north.
Tusen takk. Our next guest, International Trade, Maritime, Egil Stovik, manager of Nord University's Center of High North Logistics.
Thank you. So you introduced me now. That's my name, and I come from northern part of Norway, and our location of the center is actually in Kirkenes at the Russian border. So we feel very much now the ongoing situation. Do you want me to continue and say some words about this, these trades and what's going on at the moment? So, from our side, we have been monitoring the development of the ship traffic in the Arctic. And as you mentioned, Senator King, the ice is melting, gives a good opportunity. The traffic along the sea route is increasing every year. And we see a trend now that there is a very interest now from the Asian countries, and not only the Russia, but the Asian countries, European countries to take part in this development. So we are studying how we can do this with less footprint, less impact to the societies, but also see how we can do this in a more, what could I say, future way, with less footprint, going to zero emission. So the green shift now is so important when it comes to the future. How can we adapt to that? What type of fuel should the new ships go on? It's an important thing now in the maritime cooperation. How can we set the new regulation for that? It's so important. And secondly, the importance of how can we get access to locked energy, locked resources in the Arctic, and how can we take this out in a more effective way? And of course, being here in Maine is also a gateway, like Kirkenes, to new sea routes, like the Northwest Passage, Transpolo route. So this area could be the new hub actually on this side of the world when it comes to the future trade. And also it's important now to make space now, since Russia was very engaged in now in development and now is paused. How can we develop this now in this post, what could I say, war situation? It's important also to look at. How can we increase the dialogue? How can we keep this channel open? So I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Williamson from University of Saskatchewan.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I would like to first and foremost acknowledge the Malasid, Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, and I also would like to honor the indigenous youth that are present and my colleagues at the Awajitini committee. And we are very, very pleased to be here at this point and hoping to be able to make a difference to the organization in a way it's well grounded to the needs of the indigenous peoples of the Arctic. So, as I was saying yesterday, most of the lands of the indigenous peoples have been taken away around the world, and that certainly is the case as far as the Arctic is concerned. And resources are also something that has been also taken away from the Arctic and utilized by the non-indigenous people for centuries. With the opening of the seas and the waters, I'm hoping that in the future that there be a redress of the indigenous rights and ownership of the lands and resources in a meaningful way, that the indigenous peoples themselves have a say in how to extract and how to utilize these resources in a way that befits their own needs and purposes. So I think in that regard there's a lot of hope. At this point we have in the Arctic area self-determining institutions that already exist to rectify the destruction of assimilation that we have seen the last century or so. And by this we are hoping that as human beings, as part of the diversity in the globe, that indigenous people will be able to share the knowledge that they have in form of looking after the environment, not necessarily for human needs, but also for the needs of animals, and the way in which that the land itself looks after itself, because we see that as being an entity that has its own spirit and knowledge system in place. So we are observed by that, and I want to remind you of the fact that it's a very profound idea to be looking at the land as being a living one. So if it chooses to be really stormy, it's because of the fact that as human beings we have done something wrong and we need to rectify these. So with these, I really hope that the ways of thinking will be something that's going to be and also I would also lastly add to the fact that in the way in which that it's organized, it's run by democratic systems, and in these systems, as indigenous peoples, we are extreme minority. Example, in Canada, we are in a situation where Inuit represent 0.014% of the democratic society of 35 million Canadians, and as being extreme minority, their needs are overrun by election, by another over-elections, by time after time, and their needs go further and further down. And yet they are the people that actually gave lands to the Federation of Canada. Thank you.
Next, we have Melody Brown Berkins, the director of the Institute of Arctic Studies at Dartmouth College. When I went to Dartmouth College 50 years ago from Virginia, I thought it was the Arctic.
It's still very much part of it. Thank you, Senator King. Thank you, Lars. Thank you, Carl, for your remarks. As you may have heard last night, I'm actually from Alaska. I now live in Vermont, work in New Hampshire at Dartmouth. And I was also a polar climate scientist in my younger days in the Arctic and Antarctic, and now I work at the interface of how science, policy, diplomacy, and knowledge systems take us forward towards sustainability, and a very proud member of UArctic, a UArctic chair. I'm often asked to talk about the future of the Arctic and our planet in the face of rising climate change. And at the end, I do try to be very blunt and clear, and I usually get, so are you hopeful? Where do you find hope? And I do have hope. And I'll give you my 3 points of clear hope. And one of those we're about to hear from next, so I'm not going to say much more than the engagement of youth. Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth, they are loud, and they are telling us what we should be doing and have not done. And that activism, that engagement is so hopeful to me. There's not sitting back. They want to be at the table. They should be at the table. It's their future. Another big signal that I've been seeing, I did science, I did policy, is the financial systems are finally listening that a low carbon future is less risky. It's more stable. It's a positive investment. I have never seen that before in all of my years. And they are also not just looking at the financial signals, they're looking at the need for not only good economics, but good governance, social justice, gender equality, issues that are about humans and humans in the world. And so the financial signals of major banks around the world listening and talking about this is a hopeful sign to me. It needs to be informed by science, it needs to be informed by policy, but it's hopeful. And last, I will, of course, this network of the University of the Arctic, UArctic, a virtual network, it is modeling the strategic cooperation that we need. Over 20 years of inclusion, of meaningful engagement, of ethical and equitable work with Indigenous communities, and of just policies and ideas being put forward by a collection of Arctic communities. That is a model for strategic cooperation I hope can be followed. Those 3 things make me hopeful, and I'll be even a little more specific. Building on what Carla mentioned, we're later at the UArctic here, we're going to be talking about adoption of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. How are we as a group talking about that, forefronting that for the future of cooperation in the Arctic as part of UArctic? We also think about in the investment circle, many of you may know there's the Arctic Investment Protocol that the World Economic Forum and others came together with. This is being led now by the Arctic Economic Council, sort of another group of the Arctic Council that works with the Arctic Council, led by Indigenous leaders and businesses. And it is looking towards a more sustainable, stabilized investment in mineral extraction in our societies. And it's very, again, human-centered. So the Arctic Investment Protocol, as we think about sustainable finance in the future, there's a roadmap for that. And so let me be clear, none of this is just the right thing to do. These are strategic cooperation ideas for the future of the Arctic, and I hope the planet, that center on human rights, the inclusion of diverse knowledge systems and Indigenous knowledge, youth engagement, and financial risk aversion. It gives us a more stable, long-lasting security, and it works from the halls of our Arctic nation governments to the front lines and innovation present in our communities of the Arctic. So I hope we can move towards that. I hope diverse nations and peoples of the North recognize that this kind of cooperation modeled by UArctic protects our lands, our oceans, and our planet and our peoples for generations to come. And we have this in front of us, so I hope we keep thinking about it and using it. Thank you.
Thank you. Finally, on this side of the panel, we have an Indigenous Youth Vision, Justice Milton from Midimatalik. How'd I do? Close?
You did better than most people.
It's all relative, right? From Nunavut. Justin, give us your view.
Thank you, Senator King. Udlaku siglo yung timataling mutak sayo yung kuya yung tamane o kadlagunakto nga udlumi. So, good morning, everyone. My name is Justin Milton. I'm originally from a small town called Pondinlet, Nunavut on the northern tip of Baffin Island. And I had the honor and the privilege of spending the last few days with a bunch of bright, awesome Indigenous youth from not only the Arctic, but also from the local New England area. And we had a lot of really good conversations with everything from climate change, Indigenous empowerment, and having that sort of youth component into all of this. And, excuse me. And so what I would like to say is, when it comes to things like resource development and environmental, climate change stuff in the Arctic, one thing that I really want to stress and emphasize is when you want to build capacity in the north, say you want to hire more Indigenous people, you want to put more, let's say, Inuit leaders in management positions or positions of decision making, we really need to change the way we prioritize and pick and choose how to pick these. And what I mean by that is we can't just rely on Inuit who have like degrees or have those academic I guess backgrounds, because that is inherently Western institutional system. And so what I would challenge is for the government bureaucracies and universities to try and come up with new ways of meaningfully engaging Arctic communities, Indigenous youth into these discussions that we're having in this week. And also, for the Indigenous youth aspect, they are really in a perfect position because they know the lifestyle, the ways of knowing, the ways of knowledge of the Indigenous cultures, but they also have their other foot in the globalized, modernized world. So they're more in touch, they're more familiarized, and they have a better sense of what the world is today. And so, yeah, having Indigenous youth is super important in having these conversations. I don't have specific answers on, on how to make those things happen, but I'm just putting it out there that maybe thinking about other maybe creative ways to try and meaningfully engage Arctic communities and Indigenous peoples into these discussions. Thank you.
Hire for knowledge, not credentials.
Exactly.
Lars, you wanted to add a word.
Yes, I would like to. Is it on? Probably. Yeah. I would like to say a little about the present challenges, and maybe also first acknowledge from all of you that in a way the challenge you put on the universities, which we as an organization represent, also for the credentials, knowledge versus formalized credentials in our world. It's been very clear in this meeting that is a charge for us to deal with, and we should be able to do so using the bright and good universities we have. They should be brave enough to find other solutions to show credentials. But then I would say a few words about present-day reality in the Arctic, which produce new interesting challenges. We do have a war in Ukraine, which is bad and injustice, but all wars at some point ends. What will we then do to the Arctic? One option is obviously that we need to re-establish some kind of trust and relationship, and academia and research world, the so-called science diplomacy is a tool for that. But on the way, we know now that Europe particularly, but also the rest of the world, realize that we cannot trust on energy supplies from Russia. So we have a shift in Europe to a green shift. So certainly we want green energy all over the place and get rid of the gas and oil, which much faster than anyone would have expected only months ago. This distrust to these supplies from a country like Russia will survive. It doesn't matter when the war is over, that distrust will continue to exist. If you want to do the green shift, we need critical minerals. They need to come from somewhere. Today we buy it from the cheapest place, easiest way. They come from Siberia, they come from China, they come from Africa, and some places South America. Will we continue to buy it from them? Probably not only. So we need to establish a regime where we take those resources from our homelands. That means we will go back to Greenland, we'll go back to northern Norway or northern Sweden, or to Canada north, and find resources. And when we're doing that, those metals we are going to dig, how do we then speak with the indigenous youth and others in the north and tell them we are going to open a mine now because you certainly need hafnium to some kind of electronics now. Is the process that, are we prepared to do that? Are we willing to take the costs? I think this put a lot of interesting challenge for the Arctic, which we didn't expect should be there only months ago. And that challenge will continue beyond this war. So that will be a lasting issue and challenge for us all. So that influence how we do academic cooperation, it influences how we do international cooperation between states. And this is a new future for the Arctic, in my view, which we need to realize is coming, and we have to be prepared for that, and we are not really prepared for that. Thank you.
I now want to introduce the other side of the panel. James DeHart is the U.S. Coordinator for the Arctic region at the State Department. Catherine, I'm going to try, Havestendal, First Secretary, the Greenland Representation in Washington, D.C., welcome. Drew Horn, founder and CEO of GreenMet, and Roger Kuzner, who's the Consul General of Canada in Boston. Did any of you want to react in any particular way to the comments that you've heard thus far? Drew?
Yeah, thank you, Senator, and thank you for these great comments that I think really touch at the heart of what I think is a lot of opportunity and also a lot of need to try and find solutions to address a lot of this. So obviously the Arctic it's always been relevant, but I think it's becoming more and more so for the reasons that were laid out. There's a lot of opportunity to address climate change concerns and also to help people in developing areas truly benefit from the resources that they currently have the ability to process, to build. And I think what you're seeing is a legitimate awakening of the U.S. financial sector to address solutions in this space. I've had the benefit of looking at this from a couple different lenses. I started my career as a Special Forces commander, so fighting to basically secure minerals in places such as Afghanistan. I saw the ugly side of what can happen if this is not addressed, and you have strategic state versus state competition for vital resources. I think we're seeing some of that in Ukraine and other places right now. I've also had the benefit of serving in the U.S. government on the policy side, trying to find solutions to open up these doors. And I think finally enough events have converged that Wall Street and other financial measures are actually able to deploy capital and to provide solutions that help really show opportunity. Because I think it absolutely is possible to find ways to make it economically profitable to address climate change, to address protection of indigenous communities, and to provide options for new players to build and be leaders in this space. And I think it's imperative that we prioritize this. And so, I think what you'll see in the coming years, and even this year, is a series of projects on the U.S. side to open up collaboration between communities and resources in the Arctic to find new supply chain solutions that basically remove some of the state versus state competitive vulnerabilities that we're currently facing. And I think we're all going to benefit as a result. But I think it's really important that we have a full alignment of the policymakers, the academic leaders who really can show us the way forward in this space, and then the business leaders that need to provide the capital and some of the working muscle to actually build this growth in a substantive way. And I think you're going to see it, but I think there's a lot of reason to be optimistic.
Could you give us a view from Greenland? I was there 4 or 5 years ago, and the land was gaining and the ice was losing. Is that still occurring? Is the cap melting and accelerating as it appears to be in recent years?
Yes, it is. We still see the effects of climate change in a very real way. And that's also why we are very interested in contributing to this green transition, and especially to this debate that we're having today on hastening that transition as well. We, of course, have a vast deposit of critical minerals that can be contributed to that green transition, but we also have a lot of hydropower potential as well that can be very relevant for this energy security that we're discussing today as well. So, and that green transition, hastening of a green transition is something that will, of course, be able to benefit us as well in the long run in terms of the effects that we see from climate change, which we all know is affecting the Arctic at a lot faster pace than the rest of the world.
Well, one of the things we're talking, one of the sort of sub-themes here is minerals. It keeps coming up, which means mining, which means something that isn't traditionally done in the Arctic. And the question is, how do we do that and still honor the indigenous people's way of life, which is being compromised by climate change? Are indigenous people willing to become miners?
Actually, Justin is right there in the middle of the mining area right now. That's kind of run by the Inuit Association, Iron Mine. And the Inuit participated in creating that mine, and our partners with a multinational kind of company that from Toronto. I don't know exactly what it is, but yes, people, Inuit, are certainly willing to do that, of negotiating big industry types of enterprises, as long as, negotiating their own values, their own benefactors within the land claims organizations, and doing it in a way that their say is as a real one. Just 3 weeks ago, there was a closure of that mine right now because of the fact that they were not necessarily following the guidelines on the environmental issues. So they're right now renegotiating everything kind of up in the air. Yes, they're absolutely willing to do that and negotiating, particularly employment of the youth, not just the youth, but community members. And again, in relation to the fact that as human beings, we're not just that of human beings that are going to take over the whole environment. Be mindful of the fact that there are other living beings that need to be respected for their lives in the environment where mining might be taking place. And I think that's very profound thinking, because development over the years have been very, very busy developing for the needs of the human beings, disregarding any of the other living beings around. So we are in a situation today where 65% of the non-human beings have been compromised, in fact disappeared from this globe. And really, as industrialists and that of looking at the future, we need to be much more mindful of how we as human beings can sustain ourselves with other animals around us. Rivers need to be clean. They clean themselves. Human cleaning up is with chlorine, and that's not good for the environment. So we need to be mindful of the fact that the greatest potential that we have is actually trusting the environment, doing its own work for the safety of not just human beings, but everyone around it.
Well, one of the challenges is to do the mining in an environmentally sound way. The laws governing mining in the U.S. were last changed in 1870. We're dealing with a hard rock mining law that goes back well over 100 years, 150 years, and that's something that we really need to talk about, both in terms of mining, but in terms of reclaiming after and waste and all of those kinds of issues. Is this something that we can work on in a cooperative way internationally, so that one country doesn't feel, oh, we're just going to forget the rules and get the minerals out?
Yeah, I think that we need to work with our partners that have an interest in critical minerals, which is many of us. Critical minerals important for the nation and also for local communities that stand to gain. But I would cast it actually, Senator, I think a little more broadly in terms of critical minerals as being one example of where we can support livelihoods in the region. And it shouldn't need to be said, but sometimes people forget there are people living in the Arctic, right? And so conservation is extremely important. You've got to protect the environment. But we've got to find ways, I think, to support high standard investment, livelihoods in the region so that communities are prospering, and to do this in partnership and consultation, I think, with with local communities where there's a lot at stake.
But pollution doesn't respect borders. Are there efforts ongoing through the Arctic Council or other fora to see that there's a consensus on, and not only, we're talking about minerals, but it could be oil and gas, and it's transit, there are all kinds of issues. How realistic is the Arctic Council as a forum for setting internationally enforceable policy?
I think for setting internationally enforceable policy, not as effective, but as a forum for cooperation, building knowledge, sharing knowledge, developing that knowledge among the states and the different actors in the region. It's done a really great job. It's been a really valuable forum for that, and it needs to continue to be.
Is Russia participating now?
No.
They're the chair, aren't they? Theoretically?
Yes, and to react actually to a couple of, first thing, Senator, and thank you for your engagement on the Arctic and your leadership on the Arctic. And I appreciate how you framed this right at the top with a sense of the dramatic. This is a region that is going to change in dramatic ways. It's going to bring challenges and also change the economic circumstances. We have to be ready for that. We've had, as Lars noted, major changes, obviously. A lot has changed in this realm of cooperation, what has been a region for cooperation and dialogue with Russia in the past. Obviously, that has been profoundly altered by Russia's completely, and Vladimir Putin's completely unnecessary war against Ukraine. And so we took the decision to, on March 3rd, to pause all cooperation, all work in the Arctic Council until we could figure out how to proceed, given that it is the Russian chairmanship and given that there's no desire among any of our allies and partners to do business as usual with Russia and sit down, and do this kind of work. But I think really importantly, we've tried to make it clear that we're not trying to change the membership of the Council, that its highest value is in it being a circumpolar forum. So we want to come back to that when we can, but until then, we want to make sure that we're continuing the work among those of us who can do the work together as like-minded partners, both among the states and for the benefit of the Indigenous communities. So I think we'll have announcements in the pretty near future about how we're going to proceed with that.
Canada joins the conversation.
If I could sort of step back from that as well, Senator, and let me first thank the Assembly for the invitation to be here today and to be with this esteemed group. I'm anything but an expert, but Canada, 60% of the Arctic landmass is Canadian territory. We have about 150,000 Canadians that live in the Arctic. About 65–70% of those Canadians are Indigenous Canadians. It's an important land mass for us, and it's an important community for us. And your comments off the top are absolutely right on, because things are ever changing. Canadians, I think what I can bring to the table here today in this discussion is share with you where Canadians are, the Canadian government, but Canadians in general. And, the vast majority of Canadians still think that the Arctic is a mystical, magical place where, the Aurora Borealis and great Arctic char and flying reindeer. But more and more, they're seeing the importance and the potential and understanding the risk that's involved there as well. To Justin's point, one thing that we've learned in Canada, our relationship with Indigenous Canadians is far from being right. But it's tough to fix 150 years of history in a short period of time. It's a process, and as Justin has said, those you know, you have to put in the work, you have to have those tough discussions, and at the end of the day, whatever comes out of that, I think it's got a far greater potential to be successful. And it was always looked upon as, you know, the government has to do this or the government has to do that. We've gone through a process with Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was chaired by Justice Murray Sinclair, and his recommendations that came out really caught the attention of the Canadian public. But it's almost a year ago this week that there were 220 unmarked graves, children's graves that were discovered in Kelowna, British Columbia. And it just seemed to have reached in to every kitchen table in Canada. And there's an understanding across the country now that we have to do better by our Indigenous citizens. And so any kind of development has to include Indigenous voices, has to include the risk and reward. The risk has to be the risk has to be minimized, and the reward has to be greatest to those communities that are impacted. And that's not necessarily a straight-on government of Canada thing, but I think that's what we're seeing right across the country. So,
thank you, Justin. Do the Indigenous youth in the region where you are view development as an opportunity or an intrusion?
I could say from personal experience that when it comes to the Indigenous population specifically in the North, there can be a little bit of polarization because on the one hand, things like mining and oil and gas, they bring economic infrastructure into the communities. And I can say that infrastructure in the North is severely lacking. And then on the other hand, if we do have these mines or these corporations extract land in a way that is not respecting the land, then it is very detrimental to not only things like polar bears, narwhal, or the Arctic, but the people. Excuse me. Because in the end, the Arctic is a home. It's my home. It's some of their homes as well. And so I really want to stress that you have to have, like you said, you have to have engagement, meaningful engagement with the Indigenous communities.
Well, one of the issues, it seems to me, is that it's unclear who's going to do the developing. I mean, it could be a Norwegian company, it could be a Russian company, or the Canadian government. I mean, there's a long, and I'll never forget being at the Arctic Circle conference in Iceland, and there were 40 representatives from China. And I said, how come they're here? And they said, well, they consider themselves a near Arctic nation. And I said, well, that makes Maine a near Caribbean state. But they're certainly a major, they have major interest in this region, and they're no wallflowers when it comes to development of natural resources. So I keep coming back to governance and who's going to make the rules and how the rules are going to be enforced, because there's so many players. I think this is a major diplomatic challenge going forward. I'm getting nods. Can I get comments?
I will just say this again. We have some
Closer.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. We do have some roadmaps in front of us, recognizing that the future of investment needs to be based on the principles of human rights, sustainable development, good governance, and so frameworks like the Arctic Investment Protocol that say wherever you are in the world, you need to adopt these if you are going to be part of this, and meaningfully. So meaningful strategic investment towards with sustainable investment principles. These are on the table. People need to understand them, and we need to work through them and think more about these ESG principles. And can the Arctic is that really the place it must happen, and even ramp it up to another level, that it also has to really recognize Indigenous knowledge inclusion, Indigenous leadership, the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples. If you put those out as the format and the governments start to adopt them, then the next generation of investment will already have some of those boundaries in place. I think, again, we have it the frameworks. We have to take them as guidelines and potentially policy law. And that's one of the pathways forward.
Carla?
Thank you, Senator. I have to remind the audience as well as the experts here around me that we have structures in place that are very much based on Western ideas of education, and yet in our own communities we operate and relate to one another on oral traditions. And this is an area that is very, very difficult for the learned from the Western cultures to be able to imagine how conversations can go. And it creates a lot of tension for the indigenous peoples and distrust of, as Justin was saying, to people who have degrees. It's very, very annoying, to say the least, to be confronted by individuals that have papers to show their expertise in education, when you, in fact, you have to deal with all orally based cultures. So here at U of Arctic, we need to do something about that for us to be able to create and bridging these two very, very different imaginations of what the world is about in a profound good ways, because we can get there. There's no need for indigenous peoples to give up their oral traditions to make ways for the development. There's no need for that. I mean, it can go the other side too, because you need, as educated people, you need good imagination to be able to sleep well at night. I tell you that. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we should make clear, when we're talking about mining, we're talking particularly about minerals necessary for batteries. And so this isn't the traditional mining that we think of that's environmentally destructive. This is mining that's necessary for environmental protection to go to a carbon-free future. In order to provide electricity, we have wind and solar, but unfortunately, and I've been in the wind power business, the wind doesn't blow all the time, and the sun doesn't shine all the time, so there has to be a backup power. Right now, it's natural gas in New England. The alternative is some kind of storage, and batteries is part of it, and of course electrification of automobiles involves batteries, and that involves these minerals, which currently, as Lars pointed out, are coming from places like China that or Siberia that are politically difficult and dangerous. So I think it's important that the mining we're talking about is, I would call it, it's climate enabling mining. Drew?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. That's a great point. I call it green mining, if you will, or green energy development, because I feel that's truly what it is. And I think when we talk about these conversations, to Justin's point, it needs to start with the conversation asking the people that live in these areas that we want to develop, what do they want and how do they want it done? Because I think that can actually be done in that manner, that it's not destructive, it's not done in ways it's done other parts of the planet that are examples of how not to do business. So the technology is developing, and there are ways to do environmentally responsible minerals extraction and processing. My company, we're not public with this yet, but we're hoping to start a recycling hub that is actually pretty much minimal contact and minimal pollution into the environment. That can be something that can ideally show the way, and there's other companies doing the same thing. And I would say the same with the extraction, processing, and metallurgy of these key battery materials. Because as you mentioned, all of these materials are needed to support wind, to support solar, to support every electric vehicle that we want to build, from the magnets and the induction engines to the battery materials of every component. And they can be sourced in a green manner. But there is a contrast of what we shouldn't be doing. You bring up places such as, Russia and China that are basically exploiting populations, doing just extremely environmentally damaging strip mining. And when it comes to climate change, it's not, as you said, it's not restricted to certain borders. So if we source materials that use slave labor and strip mining on the other side of the planet, it's having a net negative impact on the climate. There's no logical way to deny that. And it doesn't have to be that way. What we need is transparency and accountability, and we need corporations and governments that have the resources to take on the initial sacrifice on the cost side to actually build things up the right way and show that it can be done. And I think we're doing that. And the reality and the truth to the market is that short-term investment, that short-term sacrifice, if you will, on returns is going to be magnified in the long term. Not just on the economic side, which may motivate a lot of folks, looking at this from corporations, but also more importantly on the social impact we have on peoples all around the world and on the environment that we all want to conserve, and pass down to our children. So I think it needs to start with asking, how this should be done to the people that call these areas home, and then respecting that and using the technology and leaning forward on the investment to demonstrate the right way to actually build these green metals and green materials.
I'll let you sell the term green mining to my environmental friends in Washington.
I'll try.
Lars?
Yeah, I would actually have a comment on green mining. I'm a geologist. I've been prospecting for metals and I'm working on oil and gas extraction. And I'm not an economist. And it was a surprise to me now I realized that economy of scale and the way of thinking money meant that when I discovered down in the ground where something valuable, the day until I found it, it was just nothing. The day somebody said we can mine it, suddenly became calculated to net present value. And any day you didn't empty it was a loss of money. If we could rethink that, look at that resource as basically almost a renewable resource, a lasting resource for hundreds of years. So a small community anywhere could have their own little mine that didn't produce jobs for 10 years, but produced jobs for hundreds of years at a small scale. And to make that happen, first of all, we need to think a bit different about the economy. But first of all, we can use the good brains of our universities to rethink how do we technically do this. Can we find small, tiny robots that go there and try and, just as you say, pick out exactly what you need at the speed you need, and rather operate many such places in different places, which don't have the big impact, but produce those 10, 15 jobs safe over hundreds of years in a place. And it is just that we haven't been able to think like that over the last 30, 40 years.
We've been talking a lot about mining, but let's go back to logistics. How realistic is the Northwest Passage, the northern route, and is it 30 years away, 15 years away? Where are we, Kjell?
Well, I'm not an ice expert on that, so I'm not sure if I can give you any exact dates for that, but we see that the sea ice is in opening, it's reducing every year, and the Russians at least say that they expect the Northeast Passage to be open for year-round traffic in the next 10 years, So it goes much faster than expected. And the test case for that is going to take part in the next 2-3 years, depending, of course, of capacity and needs of the icebreakers. But back to the discussion around the minerals, and the interesting discussion we have in northern Norway, where we are reopening the mine actually in Kirkenes, where our center is located, is that how can we do this type of mining and production in the Arctic and move it a bit up the value chain, so we actually produce where we actually find the minerals and process it there in order to reduce the transport and logistic cost. I can give you a bad example of how we did it before in northern Norway. We sent the fish over to China for packing and then sent it back to Norway for distribution in the shops. Is this a sustainable way of transportation? How can we do that as well? That's something that's quite interesting to study and look at least if you want to go more green on the transportation.
When I first ran for governor 25 years ago, one of my slogans was, "No fish should ever leave Maine with its head on." The Wall Street Journal characterized that as the most bizarre political promise in American history. What they didn't get was I was talking about let's do the processing here, which is exactly what you suggest. We can't talk about this subject without talking about military. And it's no secret that Russia has substantially militarize their border, the number of bases, air bases, sea bases. How do we react to that? Does that mean we have to militarize the northern border of Canada, Alaska? Mr. Diplomat.
Right. Senator, thanks. So we've been following for many years, and long before this latest invasion of Ukraine, the fact that Russia's been refurbishing old military bases, establishing new capabilities in its part of the Arctic. Also, its forces engaging in a lot of unprofessional activities, encroaching on sovereignty, territory of our allies and partners, and some unprofessional behavior by pilots and different actors. So those are long-standing concerns. You know, we don't do that in the Arctic Council. We address those.
The military is specifically off the agenda in the Arctic Council. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So we address those challenges together with our allies through NATO, through NORAD. But I think, you know, as a matter of national policy, our goal is to keep the region calm, to keep it peaceful. In a lot of ways, the status quo is good. There has not been open conflict in the region. That part of our policy certainly hasn't changed. We want to keep it peaceful. We want to keep it oriented towards cooperation. And so I think, you know, and we've got plenty of challenges around the world. So we're not looking to, you know, turn the Arctic into a sphere of unnecessary competition or unnecessary militarization and buildup. But I would mention also I think in the more recent future, thanks to the courage of the people of Ukraine, Putin also has his hands full. And a lot of the forces that were on the Kola Peninsula, I think, have been sent to Ukraine. They've been beat up tremendously, and they will not be returning in the same shape. So I think Russia has suffered a setback in terms of its militarization of the Arctic.
I can weigh in on that as well, Senator. You know, certainly we take our northern sovereignty seriously as Canadians. We do a tremendous amount of work because, you know, it's recognized as well by the U.S. government that, you know, a protected and engaged plan of attack, or not of attack, of defense, I guess, on the northern border is imperative. And so we work hand in glove with NATO allies, with NORAD allies. Canada has, you know, after the urging of President Obama and President Trump to up its game with NATO, and we've done that in the last two budgets that have been presented federally, but as well we know that more has to be done in the north. And I was just listening to the comments of Ambassador Cohen, and he's, you know, privy to discussions that I'm not, or we aren't, and he's confident that steps are being taken in that direction. So but it's working together, and you know, there's no one nation can do it. It's a sharing of information. Obviously, the Russian situation has complicated many aspects of what's taking place in the Arctic, but certainly the cooperation of the other countries engaged is imperative.
Well, you all, we've never met, none of us have met before. You may ask yourself, why is a U.S. Senator engaged in Arctic issues? And the answer is, I first became engaged because of trade, interest in trade. If and when, or not if, but when, the Northern Sea Route or the Northwest Passage opens up, the first ports on the east coast of the United States that a ship from Asia would come to would be in Maine. And Maine is traditionally a seafaring state. And when I first went to the Senate, I was following Lisa Murkowski, the senator from Alaska, into the Senate chamber one day and said, "I want to be the Arctic senator." And she said, "No, Angus, you can be the assistant Arctic senator." So she and I are the co-chairs of the Arctic caucus. But it's a practical, because I foresee a time when, it's like 15 days shorter from China to Europe through over the pole and then through the Panama Canal. So I see that as a significant opportunity for my state and for world trade, certainly. Other comments on, yes.
Yeah, actually, I've been really amazed to see these bones of whales whenever I'm at restaurants and I go like, oh, whaling here and there. It's a really nice sort of connection to the Arctic that way. But as far as the experiences on war and warfare between the superpowers and that of inflection upon the indigenous peoples of the Arctic, we have had such great anxieties over the wars that we had no participation in, had no desire to be in those. And an example is that between Russia and that of Alaska, many of the families had severed relationships for many years, generations at this point, where they have not been able to visit one another. And I think that that's going to be closing again, so there's a great deal of anxieties about that. The borders are relatively new, I mean 150 years or less in the Arctic. I always say that polar bear doesn't care to piss on the Canadian side and go and have a lunch over in Greenland side, you know. I mean, it's like, for us, these borders don't really mean anything because they really have nothing to do with us in many ways. So these are times of anxiety. Again, between Canada and Greenland, there are indeed family connections. And Canadian Rangers have been put in there, and I go like, oh my gosh, I hope that they're not, Inuit are going to be fighting against one another for these nation states that are so superficial for us in many ways. So in that regard, there's indeed these great anxieties. I also know for the fact that if these waters are going to be opening up more traffic in the Arctic areas due to the melting of the ice, that there is going to be influx of different kinds of people being employed by these, by the ports that obviously are going to be needed to ensure that there's some safety, human safety in that case. And there's going to be influx of people from all over the world starting to move into the Arctic lands. And again, it creates some anxiety as far as the indigenous peoples are concerned because it comes with illnesses. And historically speaking, these harbors and whatnot, they do create, of course, create new connections that really did not connect previously, and new illnesses do come about. So I hope with this new opening up of the Arctic oceans that provides for transportations, that mindfulness, reflectful kind of thinking is going to be implemented to avoid these disasters, particularly to indigenous peoples whose health is precarious in a way that we don't have the immune system to fight against other peoples than ourselves.
Justin, give me a view from the northern tip of Baffin Island about climate change. Are you seeing it?
Yeah, there is. There's actually a glacier right across from Pond-Inlet, my hometown, and it's been observed that in the past 100 years, the glacier has actually receded inland for about, I think it's around 500 feet. And so I think that's an example I like to pull out. And when it comes to the green energy and the green mining, I agree that the North has a lot of resource potential, and I think it's frankly inevitable that people are going to be interested in extracting said resources. But I also want to talk about how we can build capacity, because capacity building is the new buzzword for researchers and scientists these days. Building capacity on both ways, meaning building capacity on the northern side, building economic incentives and retaining the cultural values that we know and love. but also building capacity from the institutional Western side so that they can learn things like what our values are for the land, what worldviews and ways of knowing that we have, because who better to ask for the land in the Arctic than the people who have lived there since time immemorial? And I just want to throw that out there. Thank you.
Absolutely. Please.
Thank you. I just wanted to go back to your comment on trades and the sea routes. And so for Greenland, of course, we see a lot of opportunities in connection to this, and we welcome those opportunities. But we also see a lot of opportunities now as well. And one of those is regional cooperation that we might not have fully explored yet. For example, Greenland is a part of the North American continent, and as such, we are very close neighbors to our good friends in Canada and the US, of course, and we have very many similarities, many of the same challenges, opportunities, and yet there's still a lot of cooperation between us that has not yet been explored. And this is something that there might be an opportunity for now, especially if we're looking to hasten the green transition. And this might even expand into trade, which of course for Greenland is a big priority. But we also see an opportunity for more north-north investments and cooperation and using that expertise that is in the north. For right now, it's a lot of south to north cooperation and investments. So I think this is an opportunity to maybe change that and explore that cooperation. And of course, I agree with everything that's been said a number of times, that the people of the Arctic is always the ones who should be in the center of any change and any decision makings, because this is their lands and their resources.
Go ahead, and then I want to be thinking of questions. Okay, so I'm going to ask you for questions in a few minutes. But did you want to comment?
Yeah, first, Justin's point, capacity building works both ways. I like that. So just to touch on the North American Arctic here for a second. The difference between living in Tromsø and Oslo is actually not so vast. The difference, between living in Reykjavik and Washington, wow. We have the great similarities in the North American Arctic, right, including Greenland, Canada, United States. Quite different, I think, from the Nordic Arctic. We have these challenges, huge remote spaces, remote communities, utter lack of infrastructure, a great need for investment across large territory and finite resources, and a difficulty in doing that. But we'll have to, we're going to have to figure out how to do that in the years ahead, because the region will get transformed. Everything will move north. Senator, you mentioned commercial maritime traffic. There will be cruise vessels moving north.
If you go 3 miles here to the port, you see Eimskip, which is an Icelandic company that established its headquarters North American, and it's absolutely booming. Every time I go by, there seem to be more containers, and that's a trade that we really didn't exploit at all until 10 years ago. Brand new opening.
Yeah, so
We're sending beer to the northern countries now.
And that is a contribution. But this is a region that's going to get busier in all kinds of ways. Fishing, fish stocks moving north, illegal fishing, legal fishing, search and rescue requirements from that, pollution, critical minerals, hopefully, good, sound, clean investment. And so we've got to position ourselves. And, I think we're the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act passed by this administration has some resources to do that. Nome Port in Alaska, as that's developed, I think that becomes a magnet and an attractor. And I think what the state of Maine is doing is really great to connect into the Arctic and to see its place as a gateway to the Arctic. Here is fantastic. Senator, we had the chance to visit the port yesterday, and to learn and to meet with Eimskip and to talk to everybody there. And I think what Maine is doing to sort of put itself out there and to try to seize those opportunities early is great. And it makes me think of, the core principle that this administration has put out there is that, domestic renewal and foreign policy success are closely connected. You can't be successful overseas if you're not strong at home, and vice versa. And so you see that in a place like Maine, I think, trying to connect internationally to the Arctic and doing things here to accomplish that.
That's what we've been trying to do. I have to mention a bit of politics. There's a primary election in Alaska, I think in August, for the congressional seat that Don Young had held for so long. And one of the candidates, I'm not making this up, is named Santa Claus, and he's from the town of North Pole, Alaska. I mean, only in America can we have Santa Claus running for Congress. I bet you he makes it to the runoff, just on name recognition, as we say. Questions, and I'm not sure, do we have some UNE people with mics? If you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll try to get you a microphone.
Good morning, Senator.
Where are?
Right here.
Oh, yes, good.
Hi, Diane Hirschberg. I am involved both in UArctic and I am from Alaska. And actually, we are in the middle of voting right now amongst the 48 candidates for the short-term seat to replace Don Young.
48 candidates.
48 candidates.
I give Santa Claus a good chance in that.
There's a lot of people who think he may make that final four, along with some other notable people I shall not name. My question is, I've been working in Alaska for 20 years, studying it for a decade before that, and I continue when I go to my national conferences, when I go talk to family members in the lower 48, hear, oh, the Arctic. And there's sort of this blank look, or there's this why does it matter, or this isn't relevant to our academic community. How do we move this conversation about the importance of the Arctic? I mean, and truly, I have to say that Russia's aggression in Ukraine has elevated it. I've seen the Arctic discussed in the New York Times more probably in the last 2 months than I have in the last 20 years. But what do we do to really raise, especially this conversation, the nuanced conversation, the importance of our indigenous communities, the importance of what the Arctic means to the rest of the planet? How do we elevate that?
Professor Berkins, you want to tackle that one? How do we raise the profile? You've got an Arctic Center at Dartmouth. That's something reasonably new.
That is, well, there has been, my gosh, that's such a big question, Diane. So I will say, and let me see if I can say what I was thinking about saying, reflecting on Consul General Kuzner's thoughts, and what we've heard here is, there was a gold rush in the past. There was times everyone went up the dew line of the North American Arctic. There are times in our past where we have had this same immediate attention, Sputnik, and from what Consul General Kuzner mentioned, we've done it incorrectly. It's it's damaged our Earth and it's damaged our peoples. This is happening again. We have the knowledge, we have the networks, we have the tools to do it better. We're humans, we're probably not going to do it perfectly, but we have more voices, more knowledge systems, more understanding of the Earth than ever before. We have networks here. Let's not ignore them and do what we did before, which was think about only the economics or only the short-term issues of the conflict, which is horrific. But how are we actually sustaining our planet? This is where the Arctic is a model, a lesson. We can tell this story more clearly, which is what is happening here, with new voices, with the indigenous peoples at the table, with folks with lots of money for financing new ideas, listening. Thank you. The academics hopefully rising to the challenge as well with more holistic views of disciplines. It's not just geology, it's economics, it's arts and culture and human development and business. How can we do this and meet this new challenge at this time and do it so much better? Because we did it incorrectly. So that's, for me, the Arctic, elevating the issues of the Arctic is on all fronts. We know how to do this better, and let's tell that story and bring people to the table with a much more thoughtful, meaningful, and optimistic view, but we have to work hard to get there.
Senator?
I have one simple
Yep.
and straightforward policy response, and that is the United States should accede to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea.
Yeah.
Simple. Just do it. Go ahead.
Yeah, the last point, very good. I've been working on that, and it's a bit sad you don't grab your part of the Arctic Ocean using the Law of the Sea, for example. You can do maybe one more thing, very concrete. In Maine or New England, set up a program so students and faculty from here travel and go to other parts of the Arctic, back and forth. It's very cheap, it's very easy to do, produce a lot of relations, and that's a long-term investment in producing relationship, which again increase awareness. This is the easiest way to get results.
Great idea.
If I could come off that as well, in preaching more education to, this audience here is preaching to the choir for sure. But exactly what Lars and I had the conversation prior to the panel. We've committed just under $1 million a year specifically for scholarships and worked with some of the universities to support those opportunities for young students. I know Memorial is here, and we've got a 5-year commitment to both them and Yukon University to. We think the 5-year commitments really allow the individuals to come out and get some quality work done and invest in quality work. And I think that's how you share the message and get the word out.
Well, I think an important point in answer to your question is, and you made it, we have networks and institutions like the Arctic Council that didn't exist 25 or 50 years ago that allow us to have the kind of dialogue that's necessary. Now, the question is when and how do we pull Russia back into that discussion? But that, it seems to me, is and that's what differentiates us from my example about the Mediterranean Sea 1,000 years ago, because there was no Mediterranean Council that I know of. And so I think there's, but we have to hold tight to those institutions and strengthen them. And one way is through engagement of the academic world with the political world. Yes, Drew.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think it's important to energize the international business community. And when you talk about why this matters to your average citizen, I'll give you a prime example. So who has a smartphone in this room? Probably a lot of people, right? So you may or may not be aware that 6 critical minerals that comprise and are absolutely required for that smartphone are in existence in high abundancy in Greenland, northern Canada, in Norway, to name a few places. So if you're talking about projects that affect your average citizen, you have the choice of basically harvesting those elements, in a very environmentally damaging manner that is not as cost effective as it actually could be if it was done right. And you have the opportunity to basically, to go back to your previous point, Senator, to break down the supply chain into different stages where different people benefit, right? So hypothetically, the one concept we're looking at, we have a project in northern Canada that would produce a lot of the feedstock. You could have a green method of procuring that and processing that on site, and then, ideally transport down to a further refinement hub, in Maine. That's environmentally sound, creates jobs, and doesn't actually create pollution, but creates a cost-effective means of providing feedstock to the cell phone manufacturers. So that's an example of how every kitchen table is affected by this subject. Why isn't graphite from Alaska that's necessary for every Tesla, why isn't that procured and developed in a green manner that's far superior? And once you actually get going and get momentum, it's going to be more cost-effective than strip mining it by companies across the globe. So, I think this affects everybody, and so I think it's important to pair, the instruction that comes from the academic community and from these critical institutions with, some very real-world applications of how the international business community can provide solutions for the average consumer that dramatically improve their lives as a part of the story.
Other questions? We promise not to take so long.
I have a microphone here,
Okay.
so...
You have the power then.
Yeah. So thank you very much for this very, very good discussion, Mr. Senator and all the panelists. I'm Atte Korhola from the University of Helsinki, environmental scientist. I come from a country that shares 1,400 kilometers border with Russia, so we feel the threat all the time. But I'm not trying to talk about Russia, but threats in general. So we have been mentioning so many different kind of environmental, political threats. Do you see any elements of hope? And what is your hope based on? It would be nice to hear about word of hope, because threats alone does not often motivate us to work, but we need also elements of hope. So what is your hope based on?
I'll take the first stab at that. My hope is based on what I said a few minutes ago, and that is we have in place networks and institutions that can at least provide fora for the resolution of issues which typically don't exist. I mean, that's one of the unique things, is that we have the Arctic Council, we have the Arctic Circle, we have the U-Arctic, which is represented in this room, and all of those give us an opportunity to sort of keep in touch. And in my experience, conflict often comes from misunderstanding and mistake and confusion, and to the extent we can keep in discussion, that makes me hopeful. That in other words, we're not starting from scratch. We've got institutions to help us try to sort through these potential conflicts. That doesn't mean that it's going to be easy. And one of the questions, and I mentioned this earlier, is enforcement. You can have environmental standards, but if some other country comes to the Arctic and says, we're not going to worry about that, we're just going to get this material out, then there's going to be a question of how are the standards going to be enforced. But I'm optimistic more so than in many other regions because of the pre-existence of the institutions to enable us to try to resolve these questions. Anybody else want to tackle that? Yes, please.
Yeah, well, let me use the word optimism maybe instead of hope, because my optimism resides in our allies and our partners that we're going to work closely with, consult with, collaborate with to overcome these challenges. We're going to have 2 new allies in NATO, and that's going to be a great thing. And, you know, on that, whether they are inside of NATO, Sweden, Finland, or outside of NATO, I mean, what country, you know, could be luckier than to have Sweden as Finland, you know, as neighbors? So this is, you know, this will be good for stability. This will be good for every country's security, frankly, to have them in NATO. But then I would, you know, I would cast allies and partners more broadly. I mean, it's the partnerships that exist in every realm across the Arctic, including in the science and research community. I think that is, you know, probably the gold standard on research collaboration. So we're going to keep pursuing those, and someday if we can get back to collaboration with Russia in the Arctic, we'll do that too. Impossible to predict when, but you know, in the meantime, we'll do this together with allies and partners.
Lars?
Yeah, adding to the hope or optimism, realistic hope and optimism. Climate, changing, going for a sustainable future. I think the hope is very much in the business community, who's now want to do a change and they see opportunities in it, not something threatening in it. So that's a fantastic hope. We see in the discussion about what is Arctic cooperation, is mentioned already, fantastic change over the last 30 years. When you talk about the discussion, what is knowledge, what is academia, total changed. 30 years ago, my early days in Arctic Council, if you brought the concept of traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge into the room, the scientists were laughing at it and wanted to park it and absolutely, totally ignore it. Today, there is almost nowhere. You do not at least try to figure out how you can incorporate indigenous peoples and their knowledge into academic knowledge systems. So a lot of things positively has changed. We are on a good path. So, and there's no particular reason we should stop doing that.
Other questions? Do you have a mic? Here it is.
Senator, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Gisela Ruda. I'm a polar interdisciplinary researcher from the University of Aberdeen, the North. I'm a pioneer in this encounter of traditional knowledge and Western science, very aligned to what Dr. Berkins said. I would like to know your opinion. Why not to institutionalize the Sustainable Development Goals as a compulsory criteria, globally speaking, to orient our hopes, our operations in the Arctic? Why not to strengthen the frameworks that we have and the brilliant brains that we have in partnerships and cooperation in terms of turning exactly the elements that we have at hand and we developed so far into specific criteria that companies, stakeholders can attach to when operating.
Is that happening? Are standards being developed? Lars?
Oh, Melody, maybe.
Yes, the principles, there's, as I mentioned, the Arctic Investment Protocol. There are also standards for ethical and equitable engagement that have been established and discussed by Indigenous communities, and they've published them. They're saying this is how you work with us. There are investment protocols aligned with sustainable development, and then there are inner companies, and I'm guessing you may have, our internal goals trying to recognize sustainable development goals throughout their corporation and their investments, and this is the kind of thing that BlackRock and other major companies or investment groups are talking about, the future of their investments being towards a low carbon, potentially fossil-free fuel economy. And these are also, but they're not just about carbon, they're about the environment, social, and governance connection of sustainable development. So it's about humans, it's about, as I mentioned, gender equality, about inclusion of knowledge. These are not easy, but they are now being discussed in major financial firms and companies around the world, and the next generation of young people are looking for those companies. I've heard this, the next generation, one of the reasons they're doing it is not just to be good actors. They cannot get good quality next generation minds out of anywhere if they're not understanding that ESG or social governance and environmentalism and these qualities of sustainable development are now baked into these companies. Is it a fad? Will it last? Will the profit overtake that? Or do people really understand that this is profit? This is making money. One is short-term with lots of risk. The other is long-term stability with a lot of financial security. And as that's moving forward, these companies are actually embracing it as a tactical risk aversion strategy for making profit. That is happening.
I think one of the important parts of your question is enforcement, and how do we establish these rules and protocols? It seems to me that it's real estate based. In other words, if we establish a general protocol and then it's adopted by Canada as their rules of how to conduct yourself, then they can enforce it if the mining or whatever the extraction or whatever the activity is in Canadian territory. Likewise, Scandinavia, the high north, Greenland, Alaska. So that's part of it. And the other problem, and I mentioned the law of the sea, where I work, there's a tremendous argument about sovereignty. And to the extent you submit yourself to international law, the perception is that you're compromising your sovereignty. I don't agree with that. I believe you're doing something that furthers your rights. A stoplight compromises your sovereignty. It infringes on your right to drive through the intersection. On the other hand, it enables you to not get killed driving through the intersection. And I've always thought that that's an important concept that many of my colleagues, frankly, they view any diminution of sovereignty as a net loss. I don't believe that. We've got just a few minutes left. We have time for one more question, I think. Sir, over here.
Thank you, Senator, for moderating the session and your leadership in terms of elevating the discussion about the Arctic. My question relates to open science. We've heard many comments about boundaries, about sovereignty, about governance mechanisms. Because of the war in Ukraine, nations have indiscriminately responded by shutting down all avenues of dialogue in an international and an inclusive manner. So not naming any specific countries, but just in an inclusive context. If the challenge is to resolve these issues, sustainable development, trade, economic development, protection of the environment, indigenous people's rights, all of these things require dialogues, as you identified. How do we go beyond the emotional response of the world in the context of Ukraine right now and operate short-term to long-term, where science itself is a bridge of continuity between the present and the future? Currently, institutions are prohibited from interacting with colleagues and friends and even families in Russia, across the board. And I say this not in the sense of undermining the challenges that we're facing with Ukraine, but thinking across the 21st century and centuries into the future. A path that we have as a world to bridge the present and the future is with science. And right now, the scientific community, to a significant extent, is at a stage of trying to protect as well as enhance open science on a global scale inclusively. So the question is, how do we go beyond the emotional response where there was an indiscriminate reaction to Ukraine, where dialogues that have been developed since the beginning of the Cold War to after the Iron Curtain, after decades of effort, are being squandered in the matter of weeks? So it's a question in terms of thinking short-term to long-term, to move beyond the emotional moment and to value the dialogues that exist across the indigenous communities around the Arctic and the scientific community that exists around the Arctic, independent of the boundaries and borders that nations themselves have created.
Thank you. A big question, obviously. My initial thought is that, as Lars said earlier, wars end. And hopefully this one will end sooner rather than later. We don't know that. And I view what we're in now is not an end to dialogue, but a pause that hopefully will be over in a matter of months or a year, and we'll be able to reestablish those kinds of connections. And I think it's important to remember we didn't start this war. The West didn't start this war. This was entirely a war of choice that had no justification. And so the results, what's happening, I think have surprised the leadership of Russia. I almost said the Soviet Union, which is what they want to try to reestablish, of Russia. As I say, I think the best answer to your question is what we're experiencing now is a pause, not an end. And I certainly foresee that it will reopen in due time. Sir, I should have asked the State Department to respond. That's his job.
No, thanks. It is hard not to get emotional when you see what Vladimir Putin is doing in Ukraine. That is hard not to have an emotional reaction to atrocities, to a completely unnecessary attack on people, on civilians. But I don't think the global response has been emotional. I think the global response has been well considered to isolate Vladimir Putin. And we have done that, and I think appropriately so. You know, I'm a diplomat and I'm hardwired to dialogue, and we need to talk, you know, not just with our friends, obviously, but with our adversaries. But dialogue is not always the thing to do, depending on the moment. Right now, we're in a situation of we are arming the Ukrainians to defend themselves, and we are trying to inflict a strategic defeat on Vladimir Putin. And we have an overarching interest in doing that. Not only to make it clear that what he's done in Ukraine is not acceptable, but also to prevent an expansion and widening of the war. So dialogue is generally good. I'm hardwired to do it, but it's not always the right thing depending on what the other party is doing. Dialogue can be misused confidence-building measures don't always build confidence, sometimes the opposite. So we will engage in a dialogue when we think it's effective to do so. But right now, we are in support of the Ukrainians, and we are working on a defeat of Vladimir Putin.
Lars, did you want to give us some final words?
Yeah, this was a very serious basis for that statement, but I thank you for very considered comments from both of you, I think, on this topic. Then I would like to say thank you all for taking part in the panel. Particularly thank you for sharing us and running us so fantastically nice through this discussion. My colleague Otis Snellman have a small little gift for the non-UArctic people in the panel. You will, and I'll explain what it is while you give it out, Oti, so we save time. It is also a product of appreciation made by students of the University of the Arctic. You will get a small glass which has two fantastic features. When you drink from it and put it down, it will always balance back in balance, and the balance point is the North Pole. And in the bottom of the glass you have the map of the Arctic, so you will always know what's important in your life. And this is a design product by very clever students who worked on what would be the perfect UArctic gift to be. And this is what you now receive. So, yeah, made in Finland, very important. In students at University of Lapland to do more PR. Was there more, Oti? So, thank you all for taking part in this conversation. And we are in UArctic extremely pleased that you take your time, all of you. And you are all great supporters, and we look forward to find good ways to cooperate together for a better and improved Arctic. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us.